April 11, 1945, Naval Base, San Francisco, 8:43 p.m. The fog rolled in heavy that night, clinging to the cold steel hulls of the ships moored in the bay. A distant horn echoed through the mist, low and mournful, as if the city itself was holding its breath. On the docks, military police stood still, their breath visible in the chill. They weren't waiting for heroes. They were waiting for the defeated. The ramp lowered with a mechanical groan, scraping against the metal of the pier. What followed was not a line of soldiers, nor prisoners chained or guarded like dangerous men. What stepped onto American soil were shadows, gaunt, slow-moving figures draped in uniforms stained by weeks of sea salt, dirt, and surrender. Japanese prisoners of war. Men who once screamed banzai in the jungles of the Pacific now walked silently with lowered heads and hollow eyes. Their boots made no sound, only the rustle of fabric and the muffled cough of someone too sick to hide it. They had expected anything but this. Some were told that Americans would beat them. Others were sure they would be executed on sight. None imagined this sterile silence. No jeering, no parade of victory, just dock workers watching, hands in their pockets, unsure of what emotion fit the moment. Anger, pity, respect. A lieutenant, barely 25, watched as one of the prisoners stumbled. He looked like a teenager, face sunken, ribs visible beneath a coat 2 sizes too big. He reached to help him, almost instinctively, then stopped, not because he didn't care, but because the weight of the war hung between them like fog, thick, untouchable. The prisoner straightened on his own, gave a small bow, and kept walking. Pride, even here. The convoy began to move. Trucks lined with benches and canvas tops waited just outside the naval gates. No handcuffs, no shouting, just order and silence. The kind of silence that didn't mean peace. The kind that meant something was broken, and no one wanted to say it out loud. In one of the trucks, a translator sat beside the driver. He glanced back at the row of prisoners, their faces unreadable in the dim light. He leaned over and said in a whisper the prisoners could hear, "They look like ghosts." One of the men turned his head, slowly, just enough to show that he had understood. Ghosts were what they felt like. For many, stepping onto American soil felt less like survival and more like death. The death of an identity, of a belief, of everything they had been told about honor. In their code, to be captured was shame. To live after defeat was worse than dying for the emperor. And yet here they were, alive, but unrecognizable to themselves. What no one knew, not the guards, not the officers, not even the prisoners themselves, was that this moment would haunt all of them, not because of violence, but because of the absence of it. The war had not prepared anyone for this kind of encounter. The youngest among the prisoners looked around as the truck began to move. The headlights cut through the fog like knives. Somewhere in the distance he saw a billboard glowing with lights, a Coca-Cola ad. The red and white shimmered in the night like something from another planet. He had never seen a soda bottle in his life. To many of them, America was a myth, a giant machine of war and greed, a place that dropped fire from the sky and spoke a language made only of arrogance. But now, as the truck drove past neon lights and shops, still open late, that image began to crack. It wasn't the enemy they had imagined. It was something else, something harder to hate, and that in some way made it even more terrifying. The convoy passed through the city in silence. No sirens, no press, no one even knew they were here. Inside the trucks, the prisoners said nothing, but their eyes wandered, to the clean streets, to the children holding their mothers' hands, to the smell of bread, still warm in a bakery they passed. One man inhaled deeply, as if he hadn't smelled food in weeks. He hadn't. What they saw was not weakness, but a kind of life they had never been allowed to imagine. A world without marching songs and sacrifice. A world that smelled of safety and routine, and for some that was harder to face than any battlefield. The base came into view. A long concrete building lit by buzzing overhead lamps. Guards stood at the gates but didn't raise their rifles. The trucks slowed, the gates opened, and the prisoners entered their first American camp. Not a prison, not a cell, but something more surreal. Barracks, showers, beds with clean sheets, and on a wooden sign above the mess hall, 3 words in English that none of them could read. "Welcome, enemy soldiers." A guard turned to another and whispered, "They fed them last night, full trays, meat and potatoes." One of them cried. The other raised an eyebrow. Cried? He nodded. Yeah, like a child. But that part of the story hadn't happened yet. Not for this group. For them. Still ahead. The hunger, the confusion, the slow unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Because what awaited them was not vengeance. It was mercy. and for men trained to believe the enemy had no soul, that mercy would be the most unbearable weapon of all. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and let us know what you felt hearing it. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of war that go beyond bullets and battles. They had been told the Americans were monsters, not in metaphor, not in passing. From the very first days of their training, young Japanese soldiers were conditioned to believe that surrender meant horror, that American troops were demons in human form, bred only for cruelty, driven by hatred, and sworn to humiliation. Stories circulated in the barracks like wildfire, tales of torture, of soldiers who surrendered only to be skinned alive, of men dragged behind jeeps until they were unrecognizable. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. It was belief that mattered, and belief shaped everything. Inside the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not an option. It was treason. A soldier who laid down his weapon didn't just lose a battle, he lost his honor, his name, and his place in history. The code of Bushido, centuries old, was interpreted not as a guide to strength but as a doctrine of death. Live with dignity, die before disgrace, and nothing was more disgraceful than being captured by the enemy. The idea of the American was painted with a brush dipped in nightmares. Crude caricatures and propaganda leaflets showed them as tall, pale, wolf-faced men with savage grins and blood on their hands. Newspapers wrote that American soldiers drank alcohol mixed with gunpowder and laughed while slaughtering civilians. Mothers whispered to their sons that if the Americans came, they would tear out their tongues and burn their bodies. It was not logic, it was mythology, and for many, it was more real than anything they had actually seen. One prisoner, years after the war, admitted that he had rehearsed how he would take his own life if ever captured. A small blade tucked into his boot, a final act to preserve his soul. He never used it, but for weeks after arriving in America, he couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of shame. The shame came from what he saw, from what he did not see. There were no beatings, no cages, no spitting guards or hateful mobs, just silence, blank faces, a bed, a hot meal. The world he had been taught to fear wasn't there. And this was where the war, for many, began to truly unravel. Not in the jungle, not in the air, but in the mind. The psychological distance between the image of the American invader and the reality of the American soldier created a rupture, the kind that doesn't heal with time because it forces a person to question the very foundation of their beliefs. If the enemy is not a monster, then what was all of this for? If the people who bombed your cities are now offering you food, clean clothes, and kindness, what does that say about the war you fought? A sergeant from the 5th Marine Division once recalled watching a group of prisoners during their processing at a POW camp in Hawaii. He said they wouldn't look anyone in the eye, not out of fear, but out of something else, a kind of spiritual retreat. He said it reminded him of the look on a boxer's face after being knocked out. Not pain, not even confusion, just quiet resignation. Some of the guards tried to bridge the gap, offering cigarettes, asking simple questions. Where are you from? How old are you? Do you miss home? Most prisoners didn't respond. Those who did answered in clipped syllables, eyes down, voice flat. But every once in a while, there was a crack, a glance, a half smile, a moment of confusion when a kindness was met not with defiance, but with something that looked dangerously like gratitude. And for the Americans, that was perhaps the most unexpected part, because the myth worked both ways. American soldiers were also told who the Japanese were: fanatics, suicidal, emotionless killers. At Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, they had seen them fight to the death, charge machine guns, detonate grenades against their chests, hide in caves until they starved. The image of the Japanese soldier was that of a machine, cold, tireless, relentless. But here, in the camps, they were not machines. They were men, young, dirty, tired. A few had photos of wives, children, dogs. Some kept tiny notebooks filled with poetry. One guard recalled finding a folded origami bird in a prisoner's pocket. It had survived the entire journey across the Pacific, tucked inside a worn glove. One night, during roll call, a prisoner collapsed. Heat exhaustion, the medic said. As the guards rushed forward, something strange happened. Another prisoner stepped out of line, crossed the space between them, and helped lift the man to his feet. No orders, no hesitation, just instinct, a simple act of humanity, the kind that no training, no propaganda, no war could erase. These small moments eroded the walls built by years of indoctrination, slowly, quietly, like water wearing down stone, not with force, but with presence. For many Japanese POWs, This was not a liberation. It was a collapse. The collapse of the certainty they had been given. The certainty that the enemy was evil, that to surrender was to be destroyed, that honor lived only in death. But now they were here, still breathing, still intact, and surrounded by people who inexplicably were not cruel. This forced a reckoning deeper than any interrogation. It was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an identity, and that void, for some, was more terrifying than capture itself. One prisoner would later write in his memoir that the moment he felt most lost was not when his ship was sunk, not when he was pulled from the sea, not even when he was stripped and processed in an American camp. It was when a nurse handed him a warm towel and called him, "Sir, sir." That word undid him, because it meant he was still a man. If you found meaning in this part of the story, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps us remember that war is never just about nations or borders. It is always about people. And if you want to hear more of these forgotten voices, consider subscribing. There is so much more beneath the surface. The mess hall was warm, not just in temperature, but in a way that clashed violently with everything they had been taught to expect. The light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a yellow glow over rows of metal tables, lined with trays already being filled. The smell of cooked meat, onions, and something sweet hung thick in the air. For men who had not eaten properly in weeks, it was a scent that overwhelmed the senses. It didn't smell like victory or defeat. It smelled like something far more dangerous to the spirit. It smelled like home. The prisoners were led in quietly. Their steps were hesitant. There was no barking of orders, no physical force, just a simple nod from the guards, directing them to the line where American cooks, sleeves rolled up and eyes half-tired, served spoonfuls of food without a word. Most of the prisoners did not understand what was being offered. The shapes, the textures, the very idea of this kind of meal was foreign. White bread, thick slices of roast beef, mashed potatoes with brown gravy, beans slow-cooked with sugar, and bacon, and a slice of apple pie that looked like something from a painting. One man, maybe 19 years old, stood frozen in front of the tray. The cook, a large man from Kentucky with grease on his apron and kindness in his face, looked at him and gestured toward the food. When the prisoner made no move, the cook said softly, "It's all right. Go on. Eat." The young man stepped forward slowly, took the tray in shaking hands, and walked to the nearest bench. He sat down like a man entering sacred ground. Across the room, silence reigned. No one dared speak. The clatter of metal trays and the creak of wooden benches were the only sounds. Each man stared down at his food as if it might vanish. One prisoner whispered a prayer under his breath. Another kept glancing at the door, unsure if this was a trick. Then the youngest among them raised a spoonful of mashed potatoes to his mouth. His hand trembled. He placed the food in his mouth, chewed once, and stopped. Something happened in his face that no one expected. A tightening of the jaw, a deep breath through the nose. He put down his spoon, covered his mouth with both hands, and began to cry. The tears were silent. He didn't sob. He didn't whimper. He simply sat there, face buried, shoulders trembling. One of the guards, watching from a distance, took a step forward, unsure if he should intervene, but the other prisoners saw it too, and they understood. He was not crying because of pain, or fear, or shame. He was crying because the food tasted like memory, like something that had been stolen and suddenly returned, like warmth in a life that had only known cold. One by one, the others began to eat, slowly, carefully. Some chewed as if afraid the flavor would hurt them. Others closed their eyes, savoring each bite, not because it was the best meal they had ever tasted, but because it was real, hot, heavy, generous, and most of all, undeserved. In Japan, during the final year of the war, rations had dropped to a handful of rice per day, often mixed with barley or sawdust. Soldiers went weeks without meat. Civilians boiled grass to survive. And now here, in the heart of the enemy's land, they were being given more food in one meal than they had seen in a week. It defied everything they thought they knew about America. The pie was the final blow. One prisoner picked up the triangle of pastry, warm and sticky, and sniffed it with suspicion. It smelled like sugar and cinnamon. He bit into it cautiously. The crust crumbled in his mouth. The filling was soft, spiced and rich in a way he could not describe. He looked around the room, then back down at the pie. His eyes watered, not from sadness, from confusion. Why? Why feed us like this? Why show kindness to the defeated? He did not ask it out loud. None of them did. But the question burned behind every pair of eyes in that room. The guards did not answer it. The cooks did not explain. And that silence became louder than any rifle ever fired. For the Americans watching, the scene was equally strange. These were the enemy. Men who had once sworn to fight to the death, men whose comrades had crashed planes into ships, fired from caves until they were consumed by flames, slit their own throats rather than be captured, and now here they were, devouring a meal with tears on their faces. A chaplain who had served in the Pacific stood quietly near the wall. He had buried friends. He had seen what Japanese forces had done to prisoners in Bataan, in Wake Island, in Nanking. He carried those memories with him like weights in his chest, and yet, as he watched one of the prisoners press a napkin gently to his lips and fold his hands in his lap like a schoolboy, he felt something shift. They were human, not beasts, not fanatics, just broken young men far from home, who had been lied to just as thoroughly as any soldier. The power of that moment did not lie in the food. It lay in the collapse of hatred. Hatred required distance. It required symbols and dehumanization. But in the mess hall that night, there was no distance, only heat, hunger, and the soft clink of spoons against metal trays. Later, when asked why the prisoners were given such generous meals, one of the camp commanders replied, "Because we could. Because feeding the defeated with dignity is not weakness. It is civilization." That philosophy would be echoed in policy documents, speeches, and even propaganda. But for the men in that room, it was never about politics. It was about the moment a spoon touched their lips and melted years of fear in a single bite. In the years that followed, many of those prisoners would remember that night more vividly than any battle, not because of the taste, but because of what it represented, the beginning of a new understanding, a war that was ending not in fire, but in silence, and warmth, and food, shared between former enemies. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to leave a comment below. Sometimes history teaches us best through the quiet moments, and if you want more stories like this one, where humanity rises above conflict, subscribing helps keep them alive. In the Japanese military, hunger was more than a condition. It was a discipline, a test, a weapon. It began in the training camps where young recruits were expected to endure everything without complaint. Rain, blisters, wounds, punishment, sleep deprivation, and hunger, not just as a byproduct of war, but as a preparation for it. Meals were small by design, not because food was scarce, but because restraint was sacred. To eat fully was seen as a weakness of spirit. A soldier had to be lean, sharp, silent, and always ready to give everything for the emperor, even his last bite of rice. This culture of scarcity hardened boys into men, and men into weapons, but it also planted a seed of something darker, the quiet belief that suffering was not just inevitable, but noble. As the war dragged on, and Japan's empire stretched thin, the philosophy turned into necessity. Supply lines were strangled, imports collapsed. American submarines sank merchant ships with ruthless efficiency, and within a year, Japan could barely feed its civilians, let alone its soldiers. On the front lines, rations dwindled to handfuls of barley or boiled grass. In some jungle outposts, meat was a myth. One soldier wrote in his diary that they chewed tree bark to keep their mouths busy, to trick their bodies into believing they were being fed. Another recounted boiling leather belts into soup. In the Philippines, on remote islands cut off by naval blockades, soldiers would trade ammunition for a spoonful of rice. But the hunger did not end when the battle did. Captured soldiers were often punished by their own comrades before ever facing an American. The act of surrender carried a stain so deep that even within the prison camp, the shame was suffocating. Some were forced to wait days without food after their capture, not because their captors were cruel, but because their own officers had ordered it. In one case recorded by a Japanese medic later interviewed after the war, a group of prisoners who had surrendered in Saipan were denied food for 3 full days before being handed over to American forces. Their commander had insisted that feeding them would dishonor the men who had died in battle, so they were left in silence, under guard, stomachs empty, forbidden even to speak. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about erasure. The imperial system needed to believe that surrender was not survivable. If those who surrendered came back alive, and worse, came back changed, it would fracture the myth that held everything together, because myths feed armies more than rations ever could. Inside the mind of a Japanese soldier, the idea of capture was worse than death. Death was control, death was honor, but surrender meant being forgotten, stripped not just of uniform and weapon, but of name, face, history. That is why for many the first American meal tasted like betrayal, not of their country, but of the beliefs they had once considered sacred. Sitting on that wooden bench, holding a spoon and a tray, they were forced to confront a possibility that had never been allowed to exist in their world. that the enemy was not what they had imagined, that dignity could be given without being earned, that survival might come not from resistance, but from acceptance. For some, it broke them. One prisoner, a former officer from the Japanese Navy, later wrote in his memoir that it was not the interrogation that humbled him, not the defeat, not even the long voyage across the Pacific in a dark ship's hold. It was the moment an American cook handed him a bowl of stew and smiled. That smile, he wrote, hurt more than any wound, because it was a kindness he did not know how to return. The cultural divide was vast. In Japan, soldiers trained for years under the concept of gyokusai, honorable, death in battle. To fall in combat was to become a jewel shattered in service of the emperor. To survive was to become a ghost, a man without color or form. No glory, no honor, no family waiting, only emptiness. And yet, there they were, eating, breathing, witnessing a world that did not punish them for being alive. Some refused to eat at first, not out of protest, but out of paralysis. They could not understand how to receive something freely given, especially not from the very hands they had been trained to hate. Others accepted the food, but turned their backs as they ate, as if shielding themselves from judgment. A few, quietly and without permission, tried to share their food with fellow prisoners who had collapsed. One gave his slice of pie to a man too weak to hold a fork. No one stopped him. No one told him not to. And slowly, the hunger they had carried for so long began to shift into something else. Not fullness, but reckoning. Because food in war is never just food. It is language. It is power. It is memory. And when given freely, it becomes something even more dangerous. It becomes forgiveness. The American guards, for the most part, didn't understand the weight of what they were witnessing. To them, it was routine. Feed the prisoners, keep them clean, maintain order. But to the prisoners, each tray was a contradiction. Each spoonful, a question with no answer. How do you hold on to hatred when your enemy is feeding you? How do you stay loyal to a code that abandoned you the moment you lost? How do you rebuild a self that was designed only to die? Some would never find those answers, but many began to look, and it all started with a spoonful of food in a quiet room, where the only battle left was inside the mind. If this part of the story gave you something to reflect on, leave a thought in the comments. Your voice matters, and if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, subscribing is a powerful way to make sure they are never forgotten. They expected punishment. They expected to be humiliated, perhaps even executed. Some believed they would be paraded through the streets like trophies, spit on by civilians, and beaten by the same men whose brothers they had killed in the Pacific. These were the expectations they carried like invisible baggage, heavier than the fatigue in their limbs or the hunger in their bellies. Instead, they were met with stillness, not comfort, not joy, just an unsettling calm. The American guards, who walked alongside them, did not shout. They did not strike. They did not gloat. Their instructions were firm but quiet. Move here, eat now, rest, shower. The absence of violence in itself became disorienting. For men who had been trained to fight to the death, it felt unnatural, wrong. If this was surrender, it was not the surrender they had been warned about. Inside the barracks, they found beds with clean sheets, blankets folded tightly, soap and towels laid out. It was not luxury, but it was far beyond what they had imagined. One prisoner stood by the edge of his cot, staring down at the pillow for several minutes before sitting. Another simply knelt beside his bed and pressed his hand to the mattress, as if confirming that it was real. There were no chains, no cages, no snarling dogs, only structure and silence. This was the first wave of cultural collision, not in a meeting of language or philosophy, but in simple acts. Warm water, food without fear, guards who looked you in, the eye without hatred, and perhaps most disturbing of all, Americans who smiled. One guard, barely out of high school, made it his habit to nod politely at every prisoner he passed. It was not out of compassion. It was just the way he had been raised. He nodded at strangers in his hometown too, but to the prisoners, that gesture struck like lightning. In their world, the enemy was a faceless shadow, a machine, something to be resisted, not acknowledged. And now, that shadow was nodding to them, as if they were neighbors. It shook the foundation of their beliefs in ways no bullet ever could. A Japanese officer, captured during the fall of Okinawa, had once told his troops that capture would bring shame to their families for generations, that the only honorable choice was to die in combat. He had even issued grenades for suicide, urging those left behind to take their own lives, rather than face American captivity. That same man now sat in a wooden chair, drying his feet with a towel, provided by a 19-year-old American private. He said nothing, but in his silence lived the echo of everything that had been lost. For many, it was not just a culture that collapsed. It was an identity. They had been taught that the Americans were weak, that they clung to life, avoided pain, and drowned in luxury. That Japanese spirit would always triumph over American indulgence. And yet, here they were, defeated not by savagery, but by something far more dangerous: compassion. Because compassion forces you to look at the face of your enemy, and when you see that face, when you recognize something human in the eyes across from you, hatred becomes harder to maintain. Hatred is fed by distance, by blindness, by myth. But in the American camps there was no distance. There was a meal served by hand, a towel left folded at the edge of a bunk, a guard who offered a cigarette not as a bribe, but as a habit of hospitality, and this made survival complicated. In the mind of the Japanese soldier, the war had not just been about territory, it had been about spirit. The West was greedy, corrupt, emotionless. Japan was pure, disciplined, noble. The empire would prevail not because it had more bombs, but because it had more heart. But the empire was gone, and now the enemy they had vowed to destroy was feeding them. It is difficult to describe what that does to a man's pride, or to his soul. One prisoner was seen sitting by a tree, eyes closed, breathing slowly. A translator asked if he was ill. The man replied no. He said he was just trying to remember what he used to believe, and whether any of it had been true. These were not dramatic moments. There were no speeches, no conversions, just long silences and quiet meals. Days that passed with the strange weight of peace hanging in the air like fog that refuses to lift. Some prisoners began to help in the kitchen. Others assisted with cleaning, not because they were ordered to, but because routine gave them something to hold on to, a small shape in the emptiness left behind by lost ideology. A few began to pick up fragments of English. They asked for words: spoon, soap, thank you, please. The guards, surprised, taught them without hesitation, and with each word learned, a wall fell, slowly, invisibly, but permanently. This was not surrender. This was transformation. And transformation is a quiet, brutal thing. It does not happen in a moment. It happens across long days and endless nights. In the hush of a bunk room, in the steam of a mess hall, in the soft voice of a man asking for more food, not out of greed, but out of humility. These prisoners had been trained to hate, to die, to kill. Now they were learning to live. And that was the most dangerous lesson of all. If these reflections move something inside you, we would be honored to hear your thoughts. Share a comment, tell us what part lingered with you. And if you feel these stories need to be heard, subscribing helps us give voice to the ones history tried to forget. The tray of food was never just a tray of food. It was diplomacy in aluminum, a message served with gravy, a statement written in mashed potatoes and quiet hands. In the global theater of war, where every move echoed beyond the battlefield, the treatment of prisoners was not left to chance or sentiment. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply symbolic. The United States understood this, perhaps better than any other nation involved in the war. In a conflict where propaganda ran on every frequency and ideology was broadcast louder than bullets, image was everything. How a nation treated its enemies said more about its values than any speech ever could. The American leadership, from military command to White House advisors, knew that eyes were watching. Not just enemy eyes, but those of allies, neutral powers, and most importantly, the world that would come after the guns fell silent. And so they made a choice. They chose to feed the enemy, not simply to nourish them, but to disarm them in a way no weapon could. The act of kindness, repeated 3 times a day in mess halls across the country, became a quiet form of psychological warfare, a campaign of unexpected humanity. This was not about forgiveness, it was about control. Because when you give a man a bed, he rests. When you give him food, he lowers his guard. But when you give him dignity, especially when he expects none, you do something far more dangerous. You make him question his beliefs. And belief is what armies run on. The Geneva Convention had laid out the rules. Prisoners of war were to be treated with fairness, given adequate food, shelter, and medical care. But what the Americans did in many camps often went beyond the bare minimum. They fed prisoners better than some of their own civilians were eating under rationing. They offered dental work. Some prisoners received vaccinations they had never been given in their home country. Why? Was it mercy? Was it strategy? Or was it something more complicated? In the offices of military planners, these questions were not philosophical. They were tactical. Analysts understood that how prisoners were treated would have ripple effects across the Pacific. Word traveled, even in silence. Prisoners became messengers. A Japanese soldier captured in the Marianas might one day speak in a post-war Japan. He might tell his family, his village, his students what he experienced. And if that story contained cruelty, America would be remembered as the destroyer. But if that story contained humanity, America might be remembered as something else, not just the victor, but the standard. So the meal mattered. The fork and spoon mattered. The cook behind the counter, offering a smile to a man who had sworn to kill him, he mattered most of all. There was a saying among some American officers during the war: win the war hard, win the peace soft. It was more than a slogan. It was a philosophy. After all, the war would end, but its echoes would last for decades. Nations would be rebuilt. Alliances would shift. Enemies could become trading partners. And somewhere in that fragile future, the memory of a warm meal could mean the difference between a generation of bitterness and a generation of rebuilding. That was the long game. Of course, not every prisoner saw the meal as an olive branch. Some saw it as insult, as propaganda, as weakness. There were those who refused to eat for days, believing that the food was poisoned. Others ate in silence but wept alone afterward, consumed by guilt. Not guilt for killing, but guilt for feeling gratitude. Because to feel gratitude toward the enemy was to betray everything they had believed. This internal conflict became one of the most effective tools the Americans never advertised. By offering comfort, they introduced confusion. By showing mercy, they created fractures in an identity once thought unbreakable. And so, without firing a single shot, they disarmed the enemy mind. There was an incident at a camp in the Midwest where a group of prisoners was brought to see a film, a propaganda reel, carefully curated to show America as a land of freedom and prosperity. It ended with images of schoolchildren playing in green fields and mothers baking pies on windowsills. Afterward, a young Japanese prisoner stood and asked the translator if those children were real. The translator hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "they are as real as you are." The prisoner sat down slowly and whispered something under his breath. The translator later wrote that the phrase, loosely translated, was this: "Then what were we fighting?" That is the question the meals created. It did not matter how many calories were on the tray. It mattered what those calories represented. A crack in the myth, a seed planted in doubt, a glimpse of a world that was not filled with monsters, but with people who did not need to hate in order to win. And once that seed was planted, it could not be removed. This was not a humanitarian gesture alone. It was a strategic strike to the heart of an ideology that had fueled a generation of war. And it worked. Years later, former prisoners would recall those meals not as luxuries, but as turning points. The moment they realized the war was over, not just on maps, but in the soul. If you feel that history is often shaped more by quiet gestures than grand battles, share your thoughts below. Your voice helps preserve the moments that textbooks leave behind. And if you believe these forgotten truths deserve a place in today's world, subscribing is a simple but powerful act of remembrance. The war was fought with rifles and ships and bombs, but in the end, it was won by trains, factories, and food. Long before the first Japanese prisoners arrived on American soil, the war effort had transformed the United States into something few had ever imagined. It was not just a nation at war. It was a machine, a logistical marvel that could produce more tanks, more planes, more bullets, more boots, and more meals than any empire in history. And while the battlefield victories earned the headlines, the quiet triumphs happened in warehouses, on assembly lines, and across miles of railroad track. By 1945, the scale of American production was staggering. Over 297,000 aircraft had been built. More than 88,000 tanks rolled off factory lines. In a single month, the United States could produce more merchant shipping tonnage than Japan had built in an entire year. But hidden within those numbers was something even more essential, something that touched every soldier, sailor, and prisoner. Food. The United States Quartermaster Corps, tasked with feeding the military, became one of the largest food logistics operations in human history. At its peak, it managed over 45,000 tons of food per week, every pound tracked, packed, shipped, and served, from jungle outposts to bombed-out cities in Europe, and eventually, even to prison camps housing the very enemies they had defeated. In contrast, by the final year of the war, Japan was starving. Blockades and bombing raids had severed supply chains. Rice became a symbol of luxury. Civilians in Tokyo were boiling grass, acorns, and seaweed. Schoolchildren lined up for thin soups made with potato skins and water. On the battlefield, rations were reduced to a few rice balls per day, often moldy or filled with barley to stretch the supply. A Japanese infantryman, sent to Iwo Jima in early 1945, might carry 7 days of food, but if he lasted longer than that, hunger would take over. Soldiers learned to eat insects. Some even resorted to foraging in the night for rats. One Marine, interviewed decades later, remembered finding a dead Japanese soldier clutching an American ration can he had likely stolen. It was still unopened. The man had died with his hands wrapped around hope. Against that backdrop, imagine the shock of being captured and given not only food, but choice: stew or beef, coffee or milk, apple or cherry pie. In the American camps, meals came in trays, standardized, predictable, but to men who had not tasted real protein in months, they might as well have been feasts. For some, it was not just about nutrition, it was about witnessing for the first time what industrial power truly meant. Because war is not won only by courage, it is won by who can keep fighting longer, who can feed their soldiers, who can clothe them, fuel them, heal them. And while the Japanese war machine had been forged in spirit, the American machine was forged in steel, and corn, and coal. A Japanese prisoner once said, many years after the war, that the moment he stopped believing in Japan's invincibility was not when he was captured, but when he saw how the Americans handled their garbage. Piles of food waste, peels, bones, half-eaten bread, thrown away without hesitation. He realized that what they discarded, his country would have rationed for weeks. That moment stayed with him. It was not a weapon that defeated him. It was abundance. Even the uniforms told the story. American soldiers rotated clean fatigues. They had dry boots, fresh socks, gloves. In some camps, Japanese prisoners were given better hygiene than they had known in combat. They were issued soap, razors, clean blankets. It was not generosity. It was system. A system that ran day and night, fueled by assembly lines back home and a rail network that stretched coast to coast. Trains carried meat from Nebraska, beans from Arkansas, flour from Kansas. It all moved with purpose, precision, and relentless rhythm. And when it reached the camps, it delivered more than just calories. It delivered awe. In one camp, a group of prisoners watched as a convoy of trucks arrived to unload supplies. Pallets of canned goods, crates of bread, barrels of coffee. The trucks were unloaded in silence, the drivers laughing among themselves, sharing cigarettes. One prisoner turned to another and asked quietly, "How long can they keep doing this?" The other answered without looking up, "Forever." That single word contained the deepest fear of all, because it meant that this enemy did not grow tired, did not run out, did not break. And to those who had been told that the American soldier was weak, lazy, undisciplined, that realization shattered something fundamental. One guard at a POW camp in the American South once wrote in his journal that the prisoners stopped talking during mealtime, not because they were afraid, but because they were overwhelmed. He described it as a reverent silence, like that of men entering a temple. It was not about worship, it was about witnessing the force that had defeated them, a force powered not only by strategy but by supply. The prison meals became a daily reminder of the scale of American power. Not loud, not violent, just consistent. 3 times a day, every day. And that consistency, that routine, wore down the walls of ideology like water wears down stone. It showed that the strength of a nation is not only in how it fights, but in how it feeds, how it prepares, how it sustains. And for the men who had fought with bayonets and bamboo spears, the realization that they had gone to war against a country that could deliver hot coffee to every soldier and every prisoner, even in winter, was more sobering than any surrender ceremony. If this part of the story opened your eyes to the quieter engines of war, share your thoughts below. Every comment helps us understand how history is carried not just by the famous, but by the unnoticed hands that kept the machine moving. And if you feel stories like this deserve a place in the world today, subscribing is one way to make sure they are never lost again. In the years that followed the war, many Japanese veterans remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they did not yet have the language for what they had lived. The experience of surrender, of capture, of being fed by the enemy was something that sat too heavy on the tongue. It did not fit neatly into the post-war narrative that Japan tried to rebuild for itself. Heroes, martyrs, sacrifices, those were the acceptable memories. But a moment of weakness, a tear over stew, a soft bed in a foreign land, those were harder to explain. And yet, slowly, voices began to emerge. Memoirs, diaries, Interviews recorded decades later by historians, journalists, and curious grandchildren. They painted a picture not of battle cries and bayonet charges, but of quiet moments in prison camps, of folded towels, of hot meals, of guards who shared cigarettes and asked about home. One former prisoner, a former naval officer captured during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was interviewed in the late 1970s. He spoke not of combat, but of confusion. He recalled sitting in an American infirmary with a bandaged arm, watching a nurse change his dressing. She was young, maybe 20. She worked in silence, her movements careful and clinical. And then just before leaving, she smiled and said in broken Japanese, "You will be okay." He remembered those words more clearly than any command ever shouted in the chaos of war, because they were the first words spoken to him with care in months, perhaps even years. Another man who had once been a fiercely patriotic soldier in the Imperial Army returned to Japan after the war and never again picked up a weapon. He became a teacher. He refused to speak of the war until he was nearly 80 years old. When he finally did, he spoke of the food. He said that the moment he knew the war was truly over was not when the bombs stopped, but when a young American guard offered him a piece of chocolate, smiled, and said nothing more. He had not tasted sweetness in years, and in that moment, something inside him cracked, because kindness, when least expected, does not comfort, it confronts. It forces a man to look at his enemy and see not a monster, but a mirror, and that, more than bullets or bombs, changes who he becomes when the war ends. These stories echoed across time, in villages where sons had vanished, in cities rebuilt from ash, in classrooms where teachers chose to teach not about glory, but about humanity. Some former prisoners helped rebuild the post-war relationship between the United States and Japan. Others became pacifists. Some went on to write poetry or fiction, channeling what they could not say directly into metaphors and silence between lines. One poem written by a former POW in 1952 simply read, "I came home, but my hunger stayed behind in a tray of foreign rice and a hand that did not strike." There were also those who never spoke a word, who carried the memory of that first meal as a private burden, a contradiction too difficult to unpack, because it is one thing to survive war, it is another thing to survive peace. For many of these men, peace arrived not with parades or celebrations, but with quietness, with a warm meal served by a stranger who expected nothing in return, with the realization that they had spent years preparing to die, only to be shown how to live by the very hands they had been taught to fear. The impact of that moment rippled outward. It reached beyond the prisoners, beyond the guards, into the cultural fabric of both nations. America, for its part, began to understand the power of mercy and victory, not as weakness, but as legacy. Japan, slowly, painfully, began to understand the cost of a war built on unshakable obedience and blind pride. In a documentary filmed in the early 1990s, an elderly former prisoner sat in front of a camera, holding a faded photograph. It showed him in uniform, barely 20, standing next to an American GI. Both were smiling. He was asked what he remembered most from the camp. He did not mention beatings. He did not speak of politics. He said only this: "He called me by my name." No one had done that in years. Names matter. Identity matters. And in war, those things are often the first to be stripped away. But in that camp, in the most unexpected place, some of these men began to find them again, not through glory, but through dignity. Some Japanese families, upon learning that their loved ones had been treated humanely, were stunned. They had prepared for tales of torture or execution. Instead, they received stories of medicine, of rest, of strange new foods. For some, this was harder to accept than any horror would have been, because it meant that perhaps, just perhaps, their enemy had been more human than the empire had allowed them to believe. There is no monument to these quiet reckonings. No statue commemorates the first time a man realized his captor was kinder than his commander. But the memory lives in classrooms, where former prisoners taught new generations that war is not won by death, but by what comes after. In families, where whispered stories replaced silence, and in every hand, extended across oceans in the decades of peace that followed. This is not the story of surrender. It is the story of what happens when war ends, but memory does not. If you believe that the quiet truths of history deserve a voice, leave a comment and share what this story meant to you. Every word from you brings these forgotten memories back to life, and if you want to help us carry these stories forward, subscribing is one way to make sure they are never silenced again. They expected to die. That was the truth they carried with them into the war. It was sewn into the seams of their uniforms. whispered in the lines of their training manuals, and burned into their spirits by commanders who promised glory through sacrifice. From the moment they left their homes, they had been told that surrender was not only forbidden, it was worse than death. Better to leap off a cliff than be captured. Better to bleed alone in the mud than fall into enemy hands. Better to become a ghost than to eat at the table of your enemy. And yet they ate. In the quiet of that American mess hall, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed gently in the background, men who had once believed in the righteousness of their own destruction sat on wooden benches with spoons in their hands. No longer warriors, no longer enemies, just human beings with hollow stomachs and shattered certainties. The food was simple. The moment was not. There was no fanfare, no speeches, only the clinking of metal trays and the occasional clearing of a throat. Some men bowed their heads not in prayer but in disbelief. Others stared into their bowls as if searching for the last fragments of who they had been. And still they ate, because hunger does not care about flags. Hunger does not understand borders, and neither, it seems, does kindness. In that room, the American victory was not declared through force. It was felt in the absence of it, in the presence of warmth, in the quiet offering of something essential. Sustenance, yes, but also dignity. For those prisoners, that meal was not just about survival. It was about transformation. They had not been conquered by bombs or bullets. They had been undone by generosity, not humiliated by their captors, but seen by them, treated as men, not monsters, called by their names, fed without question, given the smallest, yet most radical of gifts, the right to exist beyond the war. And in that, they discovered a kind of freedom they had never been promised. Some of them would carry the taste of that meal with them for the rest of their lives, not because of the flavor, but because of what it represented. The moment they stopped being soldiers and started becoming something else. Survivors, witnesses, humans again. One former prisoner wrote that the most difficult part of captivity was not the fences or the shame. It was the silence that came after realizing the enemy had shown him more mercy than his own commanders ever had. He said the hardest thing to digest was not the food. It was the truth, that sometimes the greatest strength is restraint, that sometimes the loudest statement is a tray full of food and a guard who looks you in the eye without hate, that sometimes the war ends not with a bang, but with a bite of bread shared between former enemies. By the end of the war, over 30,000 Japanese prisoners had passed through American camps. Many returned home to rebuild their cities, raise families, and live quiet lives. But buried in the corners of their memory, beneath the ruins and the pride and the loss, was that first dinner, that moment when they realized they had not been fed as prisoners. They had been fed as people. In a world that had trained them to die with honor, they had lived to see something far more complicated. They had lived to see compassion. And that is the story that survives, not of weapons, not of victories, not of ideologies, but of one quiet evening in a foreign land, where men who had expected death were given a second chance, served with mashed potatoes, a slice of pie, and the unbearable weight of mercy. To those who made it home, and to those who never spoke of what they felt in those moments, this story is for you. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know how it made you feel. And if you believe stories like this should live on, please consider subscribing. Your support helps these forgotten moments reach new hearts across time and distance. Click on the next video that appears on your screen to continue exploring the history that textbooks often leave behind. Because sometimes, it is not the battles we remember most, it is the silence after them,